why don't we go ahead and get started, and then I'll invite the two student guests here to begin thinking of how to convey their questions. But what I want to do first of all is to introduce everyone, and so first let me welcome you, Dr. Brown, to our webinar and say how pleased I am that you're here with us today to talk about your work. All term, we've been dealing with issues of theology, hermeneutics, preaching, and its relationship to context and practices. And I can't think of few people who've really thought more deeply about that than Dr. Sally Brown, so I'm really pleased to have you today. What I want to do is to begin with some introductions. I want to start with my colleague on my right, Professor Bob Hill, who teaches pastoral theology here, teaches some courses both in preaching and New Testament for us, and is the chaplain here as well, the dean of the chapel at BU School of Theology. Has done a lot of important work in the Gospel of John in particular, and just let me say how pleased I am to have you here.
Happy to be here. Glad to be here.
Great. What I'd like to do is to then have the two students present introduce themselves. I have a PhD student here, Duce Lee, and an STM student, Mason Lee, and invite you to tell a little bit about yourselves to Dr. Brown.
Hello, Dr. Brown. My name is Duce Lee, second year PhD in practical theology with a concentration in homiletics. I'm interested in building an interpretive community of faith through preaching. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Brown.
Please say your name more slowly for me so I can call your name correctly.
Duce Lee. My name is Duce Lee.
Okay. Do you go by Duce?
Do you go by Duce?
Yep.
Thank you, got it.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Brown. My name is Mason Lee. I'm a STM student here at Boston University, focusing in homiletics and practical theology. And I'm really interested in the intersection of theology and hermeneutics, about how those work together, particularly as they relate to preaching. So that's sort of where my interests are.
Okay, between you it covers the whole range.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
As we begin, I should probably formally introduce you two as well. Dr. Sally Brown is the Elizabeth Engel Associate Professor for Preaching and Worship at Princeton Theological Seminary. We've been looking at several of Dr. Brown's works, a Theology Today article, and also some important entries on hermeneutics that come from the Wiley-Blackwell volume on practical theology. But certainly one thing we'll be looking at today is an important monograph that Dr. Brown has written called Crosstalk, which looks at some of the issues around understandings of the cross, its relationship to communities where faith claims are made and articulated and lived out, as well as how those relate, even if sometimes problematically, to theories of atonement and such as well. So it's been a rich opportunity for us to read into your work, Dr. Brown, and I want to welcome you to this conversation today.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is talk about four core understandings that inform everything I do. And then I'll name those and then spend some time on each one. First, I speak for all practical theology, and I should say that I work as a teacher, of course. I also teach some elements of worship from time to time, and I teach interpretation. And occasionally I co-teach a seminar called The History and Method of Practical Theology. So my interests lie in the ways that theology and cognate fields come together. Often that is an issue, I think, in every dissertation, every thesis that is written here in practical theology. How does that conversation between theology and hermeneutical insights come together? And what is the relative weight given to each? Or is that a context-specific or project-specific matter? Anyway, just to let you know how I work with these matters. At the core of everything I do is the significance of the term in hermeneutics from text interpretation to philosophical hermeneutics and interpretation as our way of being human. In other words, Heidegger and Gadamer, to be human is to interpret. So that we are always, whether we like it or not, we are immersed in a matrix of interpretation. We inherit it. We are thrown into this being. Can you hear me?
It's kind of going in and out a little bit. I can hear you the whole way, but the sound sometimes gets a little subdued.
Okay, if I move back, I may look a little strange, but is that any better? I'm more under our microphone.
Okay, let's try that.
Is that better? Do you say?
Yes. Yep.
So that's significant in all my work, to understand us as embedded in this matrix of interpretation. Second, I understand practical theology as inherently. I was discussing with Professor Jacobson on the phone an article on hermeneutics and practical theology that I wrote actually a book chapter. It's in the Cahalan volume this month, hopefully practical theology. I can't see it or not. I guess it doesn't show up. I can't zoom. But we had a debate at the table, all the authors, as we were talking about our first draft. And some at the table said, no, hermeneutics is a method. It's a technique. We can choose practical theology in a hermeneutical mode, or we can choose not to choose practical theology in a hermeneutical mode. And I said, no, we inevitably do interpretive work in practical theology. It's just how conscious we choose to be out there. So that is something as a practical theology. Hermeneutics is not a method, but a given of all our work. What can vary is the degree to which we foreground hermeneutics as an element. So I hope that's clear, but feel free to raise questions if not. Embracing this understanding of human existence as necessarily interpretive has implications for our theology. And I'll say more about that in a moment. I think it opens up some different paths theologically. Then, coming particularly out of the influence of feminist thought and critical theory, the work I do, I think about the way that power is always deployed in some way, and every discourse. Now, by discourse today, I mean several things. I mean speech, writing, art, and action. All of these are discursive practices that bear meaning. And in conscious or unconscious ways, all of these types of discourse, our speaking, our writing, our symbolism, our art, even our architecture, as well as the action we undertake within our architecture, protects power or redistributes power in important ways. But there's always a status exchange, one way to think of it, that goes on in any discourse. Sometimes it's an implicit message that we are all equal in power, although when we start looking at larger context, that's a it may be a conscious exertion of leadership, which is legitimate, agreed upon power, or it can be manipulation, which is not agreed upon exertion of disproportionate power. So I always try to keep that in view when you're talking about context. Should I assume that that overview I gave you of the terms from text interpretation to hermeneutics as a pervasive characteristic of human being, you have that down at this point? Starting kind of with Schleiermacher, do you want me to do a little review? I don't think too much of the time. What would you like?
Yeah. No, we'll stipulate that. So let's go ahead and carry forward.
Okay, so you're saying you already got that part, or you want me to just review?
We've been talking about it, so we're fine.
Okay, let's say we're there. Okay. I think from important 20th century developments are Heidegger's understanding of the human as understanding being, a being that's often in a matrix of action and interpretive practice. Gadamer makes all those important contributions like the model of play, the model of dialogue, fusion of horizons. I think that those are important considerations in practical theological work. And then Ricoeur is probably where I take a lack of energy cues explicitly. He brings the difference between Gadamer and Gadamer explicitly brackets out method. He says, I don't want to talk about method. I want to talk about interpretation as our way. His critics then say, does this blind us then to the ways that prejudices can influence our interpretations, to disproportionate power in an interpretive situation? And then Ricoeur comes along, sympathetic to critical theory to a point, and says, no, we need to reinstate the method. We start with this sort of initial horizons. He calls this our first naivete. And then we move through a critical exploratory stage where we apply our tools to the situation, or the text, or the discourse, whatever it is. And then we come to a revised understanding, a revised fusion of horizons that now has been nuanced and complicated by the methodological. So that's an important distinction. Not everybody knows that Gadamer recognizes that the project was meant to be descriptive, not prescriptive. It was not line out and he believed at least it was describing situations. Critical theory.
Dr. Brown, can I interrupt you for a second? The sound is getting just a little bit worse again. Could I ask you at your end to run the audio setup wizard?
I have no technical help in the room, and I don't know how to do it.
We'll make do that.
I can call this, but that would take me a second. Do you mind taking a pause?
I think that'd be okay. I'd rather get the sound better, yeah.
Okay.
We're fine.
I'm going to get Wendy back in here and have her extension arming while I disappear.
All right, thank you. I wonder why it's so wonky today. It's really crazy. So that if she initiates the audio setup, is there anything that could work better?
Yeah, that's what I said to try.
Okay.
Because it's not breaking in and out, it's like a digitizing of her voices. It's almost like it's, I don't know, it's, if it were speakers, it would just be cutting in and out, but that's not what it's doing.
I see it's doing. Okay, so it's the way to translate it to digital. Okay.
When we have audio on here, we need to run audio on chat.
Under the meeting, would they be using the same interface this week? Under the meeting, and then there's an audio setup wizard we'd like you to run on your end.
They're not here. That you please get in touch with Bill Brown, which they all know you're in chat. Okay. Yeah. It's Dr. Brown, and I'm in library 1010, and I'm webinar philosophy. I'm possible, going to try less. That may help.
Okay. We'll give it a try.
I'm afraid it cuts my head off a bit, but I don't have a lot of control over that. Okay. Critical theory, very important in my thinking because power is inscribed into texts and practices. The important thing is to become alert. So practical theology is that practical theology is the word that seeks to discern and respond to the transitivity of God and the living text of human action. A lot of steps jammed with strategically. The field of inquiry and practice that seeks critically to discern and respond to the transforming activity of God within a living text of human action. No, would you, David, the problem is you need the audio checked?
Right. What it would involve is going to the meeting, on the menu bar where it says meeting, and to choose audio setup wizard on your end.
Okay, Wendy's doing this now.
Do you think he's doing it now?
You should ask her, like, play silent so that everyone's quiet and then it processes that as it's
Okay.
like that. So it'll take a little bit.
Yeah, we ran the wizard, so I don't know.
Our side shows no trouble here.
Right now you're sounding better.
What if I don't, it's almost impossible for me not to move from this spot, but I will do my best. I'm sorry I'm not in the middle of the screen.
I think we're okay with that. So far we're doing...
Best to be able to hear me. Okay, let's carry on then. And I will try to stay pretty much in this zone.
Okay.
Thank you, Mindy, and I'll back. We're hurting. So, I said that my hermeneutical commitments about the nature of being human and the inescapably interpretive nature of practical theology has theological implications. Clearly it does. And just to put two options out there, this might be worth discussing for a few minutes a little later on. We could claim that the nature of divine agency or divine revelation is such that the Spirit somehow transcends or overcomes the interpretive matrix in which we live. Personally, I don't find that very satisfying. So I do have a commitment to a sense of divine agency, and yet I would claim that God works through, not in spite of, the inescapably fluid, interpretive activity of our human existence. That God works in and through it, and that has implications. It has implications about what I would call not truth, but truthfulness. Let me unpack that a bit. Absolute objective interpretation is not possible. But what if it isn't necessary either? What if we think in terms of sufficient understanding to guide practice, including practices oriented to the presence of God and to participation in whatever God is doing redemptively in human affairs? I think more in terms of a movement toward greater and greater truthfulness or congruence with the divine as we perceive God's presence through the interpretive matrix of our experience. But then we can't transcend it. There's no place that we could step back to where we could step out of that matrix of fluidity in interpretation and claim to have something like certitude. And I will say that in teaching my Masters of Divinity students and preaching, and we talk about hermeneutics, some of them love that and say, wow, you're talking my language, and others say, get me out of here, and they have to stay, so that's interesting. And we talk about that, and whether we need absolute certitude or whether we have to do with a God that chooses to be known through the fluidity and contextuality of our experience. I see practical theology actually as a doubly hermeneutical enterprise. And thinking about practical theology itself as a practice, we're interested always in the ways that religious persons and religious communities make sense of their sacred texts and their sacred symbols and the practices in which they engage. So we're interested in interpretive practices. That's one level of our interpretive commitment. But we also move to a second level of interpretive activity when we critically assess those practices of textual reading and the expression of the faith ritually and the expression of the faith in social justice practices and contextualizing faith in specific situations. So in doing our practical theological work here in seminars, we think about those two levels of interpretation in which we are interested. We are, in short, interpreters of interpretation. All of these same dynamics of the interpretive situation bear on our interpretation at both levels. When I preach, I'm engaging in a whole array of interpretive practices having to do with the context where I'm preaching, the text, the tradition that I know, the way this text has been carried forward or deployed in the past. And when I step back to think about that, I'm interpreting my practice of interpretation. Let me give a more concrete example. This is a simple one, maybe even a simplistic one, but you have the beginning preaching student in front of you, and she's carrying on about the judgment of God with a big smile on her face, and there's a disconnect between the discourse of bodily expression and the discourse of the language she's using. So as a practical theologian, I'm interested in bringing more coherence and wondering which is it. Does she believe in a God of grace who can smile on us in some way, or would she really rather snarl at us? And if so, then she needs to make it clear. So that's a very simplistic kind of example, but we do look at the coherence between behaviors and text interpretation. My concern in the essay in Theology Today, where, as I pointed out to Professor Jacobson, and the rest of you deserve to know, somehow the name of Professor Alter got changed, and I wish we could do fractions, but oh well. The article is called Exploring the Text Practice Interface. And what I had gotten interested in at that point was the great interest in narrative readings of Scripture. And certainly there's a lot of debate about the legitimacy of the narrative reading of the text. One of the projects that I took on in my dissertation work was the work of Stanley Hauerwas, who so consistently would speak in terms of the story, the canonical story, the one story that gives us our identity. We've been talking lately in preaching class, since we're doing Old Testament preaching, about the multiple portraits of God that are sponsored by narratives in the Old Testament. Very difficult, I think, to reconcile those, iron them flat into one story of God. and my concerns were similar in crosstalk, that I saw multiple and sometimes not easily reconciled metaphors of redemption being turned loose by New Testament writers in the very same context, and I thought, this has to be deliberate. I don't think these are meant to all settle into one seamless map. Nor do I think the multiple portraits of God need to be settled into one seamless map. And it's scarier to have a multivocal, plurivocal, not univocal witness. But it is the witness we've got. It's what the tradition has handed us. And this takes me back to that faith commitment, my confessional commitment, that God, in interacting with us, chooses to work through this plurivocal, pluriform witness and the multiplicity and flux of our experience. In exploring the text-practice interface, that essay, my concern was that there were these narrative readings that sometimes seem to me to overstabilize the text, as I've just described. And then that, in turn, would be used sometimes as the warrant for an overstabilized understanding of practice, as if practices could be read straight off story. One story, one legitimate set of practices. And it seems to me that contexts have a lot to do with the way that practices deploy themselves and play themselves out. So our practices are a much more complex mix of social and contextual factors that form us 6 and 7/8 days of the week, and the stories of Scripture by which we live. I think this brings me to the end of the things I would like to say. I'd like to hear from you now. I would guess, as I've said in the chapter that I wrote in this Introduction to Practical Theology that I held up earlier, I believe my interests started early. It started in my childhood. I was raised in a relatively, almost a fundamentalist, I would say, setting. But early on, I was suspicious of where some of our reading practices came from. How could we read a chapter in one of the epistles, to Timothy, and here it says women must be silent in the church, that because of what he did, that meant sort of questionable midrash in there. And then, but we can clearly see that the stuff about braids and wearing gold jewelry, that was back there, that was historically conditioned. I mean, even at 9 or 10 years old, I was bright enough to see there was something up here, some discrepancy. And I think my curiosity about communities' reading strategies and the link between the ways we read Scripture and our practices started early, and that has been a sustaining interest through my whole trajectory. Okay, enough one-sided conversation.
All right. Well, Dr. Brown, thank you very much. You've said a lot before us, and I think in the context of some of the reading we've been doing to prepare for today, I know that we've also been generating some questions on our end. So what I want to do is turn, first of all, to the two students present who've been preparing questions and see if you had anything you wanted to ask based on what you've been working on. Okay.
here we've made a shift of sorts in some of the work we encourage here. This has happened especially in Christian education, where it seems to be extremely important. Also, pastoral theology toward more empirical work in some of the dissertations. This has been true in a few of our homiletic dissertations, but more so pastoral theology and Christian education. Just getting on the ground of a concrete context and describing what is going on. Our methodological approach here has been greatly helped by the work of my colleague Rick Osmer. Might be interesting sometime to do a webinar with Rick on practical theological method. And he talks in terms of 4 moments or movements or processes that interact. And they are not necessarily sequential, but they're these. First, the descriptive moment. Then he talks about there's an interpretive moment. There's a stepping back and trying to take into account, in terms of contextual factors and confessional factors, perhaps, in a community's way of naming its faith, that might account for what we see going on. Now, what we see going on could be on any number of levels. We could be a pastoral theologian, could be looking closely at and comparing the depressive process in 2 adolescents or 4 adolescents who grown up in a particular religious community, for example. Or it could be on a much more macro scale, where you're looking at the practices of religious community, or a religious community in relation to its largest surround. Anyway, you've got then the descriptive, the interpretive, the just phenomenological description of what is going on, the interpretive move to why might this be going on. This is a hunch, this is not definitive. And then he talks about a normative moment. He talks about a moment where, and this is kind of a modification of Don Browning's, the late Don Browning's methodology, to ask, what does my inherited confessional vision help me see in terms of the theological meanings being proposed in the behavior, or theological meaning that could be brought to bear in the situation. Norms can function in different ways. And then the 4th step, or process, I see them more as overlapping processes, and you move, I think, as you're doing your work, among these 4. The 4th is the strategic. In light of what we see going on, in light of our understanding of why it is going on, in light of the specific theological vision, set of claims or set of practices we have, what could be going on? What could change? What would lead to greater flourishing on the part of the persons that were examined, or the communities? So that is one way to relate the normative and the descriptive. And again, I think the important thing is to tease them apart and realize when we're doing one and when we're doing the other, because it makes things a whole lot clearer. So for me, the confessional, to me, the idea that practices can be read directly off biblical narrative, or even, strong case, the air quotes, biblical narrative, is a confessional claim. But then, what if that doesn't square with what I see going on the ground? Okay? So I'll tell you a story from an Episcopal church I know of. In this Episcopal church, the verger would come down the aisle, leading the procession with the cross, and then would stop halfway down the aisle and drop down to one knee, as if to reverence the altar. Then stand up again and continue the procession. And newcomers would come and ask, why is this happening? And there was a theological explanation for why this seemed appropriate, and so on and so forth. And then one day, the proverbial elderly lady who had been there since her baptism spoke up and said, no. This has nothing to do with theology. Before they fixed the roof, they had to hold together the two sides of the building with a big rafter. You couldn't get the cross that high unless you put it underneath. So, and we've been doing it ever since, rafter, no rafter. So you have to look for the rafters. You have to look for the history and for the contextual factors that bear on a practice. Instead of just trust the straight up confessional account of why things are being done as they're being done. And there's a feedback loop between what is being done and the way scriptures are being read, for example. We know from our own Presbyterian history, my own Presbyterian history, and each of you would have your own confessional settings, that there were good reasons to read the New Testament as prohibiting the leadership of women in pastoral and preaching roles. Because a lot of the people who were interpreting the book had a stake in the power that this reading gave them. Names. So in-place practices tend to reinforce reading strategies, and reading strategies can reinforce practices. And it isn't until you get someone willing to ask questions about how these things came to be that you begin to destabilize that link between reading strategies and practices. Reading strategies are themselves a practice, but often a less conscious one in most religious. Does that answer your question, or?
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
I wanted to, there's a question that Duce Lee has typed into the chat room. I'm going to go ahead and read it aloud, just so we set it out before everybody.
Okay.
So Duce says...
I only see part of it, so read away the display.
In your book, Crosstalk, Duce sees a sort of underlying assumption of at least tentative harmony embedded in the web or system of metaphors and symbols. In reality, there are several metaphors or symbols that bring about multiple conflicts among the congregation. The problem may be compelled, complexified if each individual has a different religious or cultural background. While it is possible to provide other interpretation on those symbols, like you did in the book, there may be symbols that are not easy to provide another interpretation. If this is the case, how should we deal with this difficulty? So one thing my sense to say that he's interested in is this idea of interpretive communities and how communities are very multivocal or plurivocal.
Yeah.
And so the way in which we deal interpretation has to deal with that diversity as well. Am I understanding this correctly? Okay.
Well, part of my proposal in Crosstalk, I don't know if I'm entirely understanding your question. Do you want to try to give me an example of one of those symbols or symbol systems that has a particular interpretation attached to it and it's hard to provide an alternative?
For example, Jesus as the lamb, Jesus as symbol, right? And the lamb is, sometimes interpreted as a scapegoat image, or there are different interpretation, and there might be dominant interpretation of a certain symbol, and then some people, these days people are from different backgrounds, religious or cultural backgrounds, having different understanding of certain symbols and multiple symbols. So in that case, there might be conflict among the congregation. Some people will say Jesus lamb is scapegoat image, or just maybe our sin is washed off by the blood of the lamb, or different interpretation can be possible in one's congregation. In that case, how do we balance, or how do we navigate this difficulty? Or do we need to find a common understanding, or It is not.
Okay, I think you've just given some very good language, balance and navigate. Stick with that. The proposal in the book is that we don't need to homogenize the interpretations or reduce them to a single one. Back to record. As I argued in crosstalk, metaphors are tensive forms of meaning in which two unlike zones of experience are drawn together. They tend to push apart because they're different. Jesus as Messiah, lamb, sacrificial lamb. And yet the tradition has pulled them together. And at the same time, they push apart. Remember in the book I talked about every metaphor says is and is not at the same time. Very important ingredient in Ricoeur's theory of metaphor and why I prefer it to many other efforts to speak of metaphor. Because it hangs on to the affirmation and the disconnect at the same time, and somewhere in that living tension is truthfulness, not one truth, but truthfulness and a range of truthfulness. Even in talking about the different animals associated with the purgation of sin, the removal of sin, he talked about scapegoat, and then he talked about the blood of the lamb. The scapegoat never sheds its blood. The scapegoat is driven into the wilderness. So that's one function, and then the sacrificial lamb is another. To really mix it up, if we understand Jesus as the embodiment of divine presence, who's making the sacrifice? Are we? No. We are not presiding. So that upends the dynamics of sacrifice. It's God offering God's self in a sacrificial manner that we can recognize, but we are not participants, we're only beneficiaries. So there are already a lot of different semantic vectors going on. By semantic, I mean meaning. By vector, I mean different directions that meaning is going as you bring together all the understandings of Jesus as scapegoat, as lamb. And then, very interesting to read is Brian Blunt's Can I Get a Witness? Where he is, he's dealing with Revelation, and I've mentioned him in crosstalk. And he talks about the slain lamb of Revelation, the triumphant, wound-bearing lamb of Revelation. So I actually would expand the number of ways of understanding the scapegoat, the sacrificial lamb, the triumphant lamb of Revelation. Brian Blunt talks about the slain lamb who lives. And I would take advantage of those differences rather than try to reconcile them. Now that's challenging to some congregations. I don't underestimate the jump we're asking people to make from a univocal understanding of religious truth to a plural understanding of truthfulness about redemption. Do you want to follow up on that?
Yes. In that case, so you are sort of juxtaposing those understandings all together, right?
Mm-hmm. And seeing legitimacy in each of them. So you notice in the book, although I see penal, substitutionary, atonement theory as having some problematic implications, I think it is still a legitimate metaphor. A metaphor that had currency at the time that it was developed. I think every time I say that, I feel the the grave of Charles Hodge over there in Princeton rumbling, but at any rate, it had contextual currency. It spoke in a compelling way to some. Many, as a matter of fact. Unfortunately, I think it became the master metaphor. And in fact, you know, it became a dead metaphor. A dead metaphor is one that's forgotten to be modest. And it settles into the is and forgets the is not. So I see it as problematic, but I don't want to banish it from the room. I want to acknowledge the ways in which drawing on context and on particular parts of Scripture, particular readings of Scripture, particular readings of human experience, it can reveal something. But metaphors reveal, I believe, different aspects of what is the case of an event, which remains ultimately mysterious and beyond us. So I'm asking for the modesty of standing down on the project, of giving a comprehensive, complete, and finished account of the dynamics of redemption, which I see as open-ended anyway.
You know, there's a flip side to your virtue of modesty, and that's the theology of mystery.
There is, yeah. Right.
And I think there's a profound theological claim lurking within that too, and the very provisionality of the way you're talking about the theological metaphor and the task beyond systematicity.
Yes, I think there's been an immodesty, and I think I'm standing in the middle of one of the geographic epicenters of systematic immodesty in history. But you know what's been so interesting to be around the Bardians who are here, Bruce McCormick and George Hunsinger, and to an extent Stacy Johnson and others who make use of Bart. Deborah Van Dusen Hunsinger in her pastoral theology makes use of Bart. But the drift here has been more and more to embrace Bart's constructive side. Bart is constructive and ad hoc theologian, rather than attempting a comprehensive, close, a systematic project that aims for closure. It's a systematic exploration that seems to widen out further and further into wider possibilities, at least in some of its aspects.
Well, I have to say, I find that fascinating too, from the standpoint of what we call homiletical theology, if nothing else, because it invites us to see the provisionality of our own theologians. At this point, I need to wrap it up. We got to the end of the hour, but I didn't want to do that without first of all recognizing one of our participants today who's online. His name is Graham Hill. Graham is a div student at Boston College who took a course in homiletic theory last term. So glad that he was able to come, so a shout out to Graham Hill at Boston College. But I also want to thank those who gathered with me here today to hear you speak, and chiefly to thank you, Dr. Brown, for leading us through a very interesting discussion. And thank you for your persistence despite all the difficulties with the sound. You really made it worthwhile in terms of helping us to see in greater depth what your project is about and how it relates to the kinds of tasks and practices that we're thinking about here. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome, and Professor Jacobson has my email. If any of you would like to pursue this, make an observation, ask a question, I'd be delighted to respond.
Oh, thank you so much. Grateful for the invitation. All right, blessings to you.
Thank you.
You as well.
All right.